Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. And this Green Socialist podcast is one of the things we're doing to continue advancing the program that we ran on. So I got a few comments about what's going on. You're probably going to be scooped on this because I have seen no reporting or commentary on the fact that this Freedom to Vote Act, which is the pared down version of the For the People Act on voting rights, completely terminates public funding for presidential campaigns. This is a post-Watergate reform that the major party candidates as well as minor party candidates used in the 1900s, right up until the year 2000 when George W. Bush decided he would not take the fall public campaign grant because he could raise so much money from rich folks. And by 2008, Obama did the same thing, taking neither the primary matching funds, which is one program, or the general campaign grant. And since then, the major party candidates haven't used it. It's only the Green parties that used it. So there was always a Republican bill by people like Joni Ernst, the Republican senator from Iowa, to get rid of this presidential election campaign fund. Well, now the Democrats put it in their pared down, supposedly improved Voting Rights Act, which Chuck Schumer says they want to vote on this week. So I have an article. The only thing I know, it's been published on it up in Counterpunch right now. And I'm going to try to put that in the chat so people can see that. I think I'll put it in a private chat because I'm not sure I can get to the public chat. So you can take a look at that. It's short. It's only 500 words. It just gives you the news that I just talked about. It's called Freedom to Vote Act for capitalist parties only, because only the Green Party is using this public campaign financing. They do include the House candidate program, which to qualify, you need to raise $50,000 in contributions of $200 or less, at least 1,000 contributors. And I went through all the Greens, 544 Greens who've run for the House since 1994 through 2000 with Mike Feinstein. And we could only find one Green candidate in all those elections that would have qualified under this new standard. One or two others might have. So it's really beyond the reach of most Green candidates. So this public funding, they're taking the presidential election campaign fund and just putting that money in a new fund for House candidates, which will be beyond the reach of upstarts like the Greens or other independent, particularly independent progressives that don't take corporate money. So instead of raising public money that would be used in the presidential campaign fund so that candidates that didn't want to be beholden to commercial special interests could run a credible presidential campaign, they just eliminated it and handed it over to the billionaire class and the 100 millionaires class. And it's amazing to me that no reporters, no commentators have even noticed this. And Schumer said they're going to vote on it this week. We'll see. It's not going to pass. Manchin has to get 10 Republicans. I would say the odds of that are about 1 in 1,000, because none of the Republicans want any kind of public campaign financing. What we ought to advocate is that they just get rid of the public campaign financing in the Freedom to Vote Act and get it passed for the things that there are good in it. It preempts these Republican state laws that have been passing to suppress votes, suppress voters, overturn election results in Republican-controlled legislatures, allow the intimidation of voters and election officials in places like Texas and their new law, and of course, partisan gerrymandering, which means if this is allowed to go through, the Republicans are going to continue to hold at least 30, what they now have, both houses of state legislatures, and take back the House, even though nationwide they will get a minority of the votes for the House of Representatives. So it's entrenching minority rule by the Republican Party. And the Democrats can't get rid of the filibuster in order to get this passed. That's what it's going to take. And it's not just voting rights, as important as that is. It's, the good reforms the Democrats have passed in the House. DC statehood, the PRO Act, which may be, parts of it may be in this reconciliation bill, we'll see. The Equality Act, so that people with are not discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in federal anti-discrimination laws. The bill to codify Roe v. Wade, the Women's Health Protection Act. There's a whole lot of good things that could pass if it weren't for the filibuster. And we will see this week, it may be we get the test. If they vote on it and the Republicans vote it down, are the Democrats then going to turn around as Manchin, Sinema, and as many as a dozen other Democratic senators going to say, okay, we'll at least lift it for voting rights. Although we'd like to see it just lifted so these other reforms I talked about could pass. So that's what's going on in the world of our so-called democracy. Another thing happened yesterday that didn't get a lot of attention, but it's pretty bad. The Biden administration announced they're going to be flying and deporting 14,000 Haitians who have come to Del Rio, Texas, avoiding political persecution and the devastating effects of that earthquake. And no due process, no chance to apply for asylum. They're just going to herd them on the planes and fly them back to a fate unknown. And they're using Trump's Title 42, which was presumably, ostensibly, to stop the spread of COVID. A federal judge blocked that on Thursday. And on Friday, the Biden administration announces, well, we're going to start deporting them anyway, and we're appealing that ruling. You know, I got another suggestion. Why don't you test these immigrants to see if they've got COVID and vaccinate them? We got vaccinations sitting around because we have a bunch of people in a death cult in this country that won't get vaccinated. Let's put those vaccinations to good use before they expire. And so, you know, the other thing coming up is this reconciliation infrastructure bill. They are negotiating the details as we speak now. The pundits in Washington, it started out at a little over $6 trillion when you combine, which this does, the Biden's American Jobs Plan and his American Families Plan, both the physical infrastructure and the social infrastructure. And the pundits think by the time they get through negotiating, it's going to be $2 to $2.5 billion over 10 years, about a third of what Biden proposed. Of course, the progressives at one point were saying we need 10 trillion, and they're talking mostly about climate. And the climate portion there's a lot of stuff leaked out. It's totally inadequate. I think the question is, if they cut it back that much, are they going to do a half-assed job of everything? You know, the good things this bill wants to do, like universal pre-K, affordable childcare, 2-year community colleges, expanding Medicare to cover hearing and eyesight and dental. Or are they going to do it half-assed? I mean, it'd be better, in my opinion, to do a few things well and then come back to fight for the other things later than to do them all in a way that they are not implemented well, and then they lose credibility. And I think one thing we have to understand is, forget the Republicans. They're irrelevant because they're going to vote no on all this stuff. It's the Democrats negotiating with themselves. And there are a lot of Democrats, more than are out publicly, like Manchin and Sinema on the Senate side, who really don't want to spend that much. They're corporate Democrats. They're the old neoliberals. And this really came out this week when it became clear that these 3 members of the House that are opposing Medicare negotiating down prices from Big Pharma, these are people like Kathleen Rice here in New York on Long Island. She campaigned for Medicare negotiations. Now she's fighting it. And we know from FEC campaign finance reports that she and this guy in California named, his name's escaping me, Peters, and another guy in Michigan, these are backbenchers. They are not prominent members of Congress, but with only a margin of 3 votes now in the House for the Democrats, they're the difference. And that makes a huge difference. We're paying 10 times as much for prescription drugs that they are just across the border in Canada. And Kathleen Rice, if you remember, was the person that the Democratic leadership found to run against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when she wanted to be on the House Energy and Commerce Committee last December. And that's the committee that deals with Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. Logical place for AOC. But the leadership of the Democratic Party didn't want her. So their policy and Policy and Steering Committee voted 46-13 for Kathleen Rice over AOC. So that tells you the balance of forces in the Democratic Party, which is why I'm pretty pessimistic that we're going to get any of these reforms. And of course, it all depends on the filibuster. And this week, if they vote on the Freedom to Vote Act, we will get a pretty good idea whether that filibuster is going to hold or whether the Democrats are willing to lift it, at least for issues like constitutional rights, which would include the Women's Health Protection Act to codify Roe, as well as voting rights. They could do that. We will see. So that's where we're at right now. And I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Scout Trooper 164. Why does Joe Biden continue to believe that keeping Trump's policies will allow him to gain favorable views from Republicans, despite them being extremists? Yeah, it's really hard to believe that Joe Biden really believes that, because the hardcore Republicans, it's not about policy for them. It's about what team they're on. And for a lot of them, it's white identity politics. They're on the racist team. These are the old Dixiecrats. And the upper class Republicans, the country club Republicans, who are willing to tolerate that so they can get their tax cuts. They don't have to pay taxes. That's really what the Republican Party is. And I think Bernie Sanders has a better idea. He's gone out to some of these Trump country venues recently, making the case for the reconciliation infrastructure bill and what it will do. And that's a rational argument that I think can peel off some of those Trump voters. But yeah, Biden keeping Trump policies, trying to appease them. Obama tried that. He tried that on immigration. That's why he became the deporter in chief. He tried that on bailing out the banks instead of the people after the Great Recession. And a lot of good it did him. He got his ass whooped in 2010 by the Tea Party. So, the way to deal with your opponents is to fight them on the issues with rational arguments, not pander to them, because they'll just take that as a sign of weakness that you can be beaten. So I don't know if Biden really believes that, but he's acting like he does. And maybe, he's not going to win many grassroots Republicans because they're on their team. I think he still thinks he can win some of his old colleagues in the Senate, despite them telling him, I don't know how many ways, drop dead, we're not coming along. Except for Murkowski on the John Lewis voting rights bill, but that's the only one. So, yeah, I'm not sure what Biden's game is there, but he better get speaking out on the filibuster. He did tell Schumer, I'll start making phone calls when you ask me, but we haven't heard anything about the phone calls. And if Schumer does bring this Freedom to Vote Act up for a vote this week, it's going to be too late for phone calls. So we will see. Debs, can you honestly claim working class people support vax mandates? What does it say that the United States Postal Service can resist them? I'm not familiar with the, Debs. Yes, I mentioned last week that I don't want mandates weaponized against the poor who are disproportionately unvaccinated. We would still like to see HH address that if there's time. Look, the vaccines are free. It shouldn't be an issue for the poor. The problem is information, and also giving them time off from work so they can go get vaccinated. That is a solvable problem. I don't know about the U.S. Postal Service position on vaccinations. Well, I'll tell you, in my post office, they get really angry when these Trump people come in and start ranting about vaccines. They ran back at them. So, I don't know what the story is there. But look, the polls show the people are for vaccines, including working class people. Yeah, there's some holdouts, but mainly it's coming from, the Trump base, which is middle class. They are the the petty bourgeoisie, the small business class, the supervisors, the low-level managers. That is where the strength of the anti-mandate thing is coming from, not the working class. Diane M. Brooks, my question is, how can you persuade religious leaders to support a national health service when Catholics operate a high percentage of hospitals in the U.S.? Yeah, the religious leaders don't want a national health service, particularly if it provides reproductive services, including abortion, which it should. And so they do operate a lot of hospitals. Of course, the National Health Service that I proposed during the campaign would, over 10 years, make all the hospitals part of a publicly owned national health service. So they would work under public direction, not the direction of the Catholic hierarchy. So I'm not sure we're going to persuade some of those religious leaders in the Catholic Church who are anti-abortion. But we don't need them, because the majority of people are for a single public payer providing all medically necessary services. You know, there was an exit poll done by Fox News during the last election in 2020, and it asked, do you want a government-run health service? Of course, Fox phrased it in a way that they hoped would get a low percentage of people saying yes. 70% of the people said yes. So you don't have to have unanimity to get things done. So I don't think the Catholic hierarchy is necessary to get a national health service. Scout Trooper 164, Howie, do you agree that 911 was also used as a way to divide the American people in terms of a political standpoint? Now we're talking about, I think, the neocons, with the support of the Democrats, who wouldn't call themselves neocons, most of them supported, all of them but Barbara Lee supported the war in Afghanistan. The majority of them supported the war in Iraq. There was a lot of unity coming out of that, and they wanted to unify the Americans behind, a revenge narrative. Of course, the Green Party at the time, and also the Socialist Party at the time, which also nominated me and Angela Walker as their presidential ticket, made statements shortly after 9/11 saying, this is a crime against humanity. It should be treated as criminal investigation and prosecution, not an excuse for war. And going into the Middle East and occupying countries and changing regimes and creating the mayhem we have created over the last 2 decades. So I don't think they wanted to divide the American people. I think, Bush and Cheney and them thought they could unite us behind their imperial project. And to an extent they did, until, it started going bad in 2005 and 6, when the insurgency really started causing a lot of American casualties. And you had very liberal commentators supporting what they called humanitarian intervention, which it really wasn't. I mean, you look at what we did to Iraq and what we did to Afghanistan. There's some good reporting out. Anand Gopal, who is a great reporter, he doesn't sit in some university or some capital and, get on the phone and look at social media to find out what's going on. He actually embeds himself in among the people who are resisting in both Syria and Afghanistan. He did that with the Taliban and wrote a great book called No Good Men Among the Living, I think it's called. And he just has an article out now in the New Yorker this week. He's in Afghanistan now, and he went out to Helmand Province, to the rural areas. And you may have seen reports in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal about how the people there are so happy that the U.S. left because the war is over. And they may not love the Taliban, but at least they're not dodging bullets and bombs. And and then we had this, and the Pentagon now admits they killed a USAID worker along with 7 of his children and nieces and nephews in that second drone attack in response to the suicide bombing by ISIS-K around the Karzai airport. And they mistook the man putting water bottles in his car for packing it with explosives. And so it's a total tragedy. But the thing is, this has been going on for 20 years. And that's why you have people all over Afghanistan that hate the United States because they killed their people, members of their family. So Anand Gopal went and talked to women, which is hard to do if you're a man, but he made links to men he knew who got him in touch with grandmothers who enabled him to interview these women who told him. He talks about this one woman, I think her name's Rashida. She lost 16 close relatives to U.S. Bombs and assassinations. And then he talks about, and he talked about it in his book, how the U.S. didn't know who they were dealing with. So the Taliban was totally defeated and willing to negotiate, some kind of accommodation. So the new government, they might get it included partly, but this was within a year of our occupation. And the Bush administration totally rejected that. And in fact, brought in warlords. And as Anand points out, they didn't have warlords in Afghanistan before the U.S. started intervening in the 70s. Before the Soviet invasion, when some university students calling themselves communists got a portion of the military to stage a coup and put them in power. So the conservative rural areas started rebelling, and the U.S. started supporting Islamic fundamentalists against this so-called communist regime. And ever since then, we basically propped up warlords who became the local power with all the arms in different valleys and regions of Afghanistan among these different tribal groups. And when we went into Afghanistan again with large forces after 2001, after 9/11, we brought these warlords back. In Anand's article, it's in the New Yorker. It's this week. And that's really worth reading to understand what a mess we made in Afghanistan. And I mentioned Syria. Anand went into Idlib province in recent years in areas that were resisting both Assad and the Al-Qaeda and other affiliated Islamic fundamentalist groups. And there's some inspiring stories on how the people are still fighting for freedom and democracy and express it every chance they get in that terrible proxy war with all these outside powers. So we've made a mess in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. So that's a long answer. I think, Bush and them wanted to unite us behind their imperial project, but the imperial project fell apart. And of course, now we're divided on what we do about that. There are still some people that say we should still be in Afghanistan to protect the rights of women in particular, in civil society more generally in the urban areas. Greg Palast had a heartfelt essay to that effect, but I think he's wrong given the role the U.S. military actually played. We should provide humanitarian aid, conditioned on it being available to, women and civil society. But the Taliban need money, so maybe we can negotiate that and do some good and some reparation toward the terrible damage we've inflicted on that country for the last 40 years. Mr. Anderson, opinion on selling nuclear-powered subs to Australia. And what do you think about France being upset about the U.S. taking a sale away from France to Australia? Yeah, well, nuclear-powered subs with nuclear weapons, I'm opposed to. We've got to be talking about disarmament. So, and also selling those subs to Australia really kind of escalates the tensions with China, which we don't need. I mean, there are a lot of things to criticize about China on human rights and democracy, and I'll be the first to do it. But we got to work with China on climate issues, on nuclear weapons disarmament, and on making sure the world economy recovers from this COVID pandemic. So I think we need to talk about the human rights issues, but don't condition talks on these other issues on the human rights progress. So I'm opposed to the sale of those subs, whether it was to France or Australia. Beth Graham, Howie, have you been following the Canadian election? Do you have an opinion on Annamie Paul and the Canadian Green Party in general? The Canadian election, a little bit. I did follow the leadership contest for the Green Party Canada between Annamie Paul and her opponent, who I don't remember, but considers himself an eco-socialist. And I thought that was interesting. I think the Canadian Green Party, I think its politics are getting better, more eco-socialist, although the eco-socialists didn't win that leadership contest. But the Canadian election, damn, what do I know about that? I read something recently. I've been more following Europe. So you remind me I've got to catch up on the Canadian election, which I think is coming up pretty soon, if I'm not mistaken. Living in Furnace. The only nation I believe is reasonably possible to use a bunch of nukes is the USA. Yeah, and we've used them many times since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As Daniel Ellsberg has pointed out many times, we use them the same way a mugger puts a gun to your head and says, give me your money. For example, when, Trump or before him, Obama said, all options are on the table in dealing with Iran. All options include nuclear weapons. They're telling Iran, we might nuke you if you do something we don't like. We've done that to many countries almost every year since we got nuclear weapons. So we have used the nukes. Now, using them in an offensive way, frankly, I wouldn't put it past Russia. They have a nuclear doctrine called, and we'd have the same doctrine called escalate to de-escalate, where in a conventional war, if you're losing, you would use a tactical nuke to throw back the conventional forces you're fighting and then de-escalate, which is crazy because it's not going to happen. As Daniel Ellsberg again points out in his latest book, The Doomsday Machine, it's automated. Once the nukes start flying, they're all going to fly and it's going to be the end of us. We have, the US isn't the only country with dangerous, irrational leaders. And there are 8 countries with nuclear weapons. Pakistan, which supports Islamic fundamentalism and is in conflict with India, which is ruled by a Hindu fundamentalist government. That's a very dangerous situation. I wouldn't put it past Israel to use nukes if they felt it was necessary. So I think, there are a lot of possibilities for the use of nuclear weapons, which is why when we campaigned in 2020, we said the U.S. should take disarmament initiatives, pledge no first use of nuclear weapons, start disarming to a minimum credible deterrent, and on the basis of those initiatives, go to the other nuclear powers and say, we are ready to negotiate complete and mutual nuclear disarmament. And then have world of public opinion on our side. There is a new treaty called the treaty, it abolishes nuclear weapons. What's it called? The formal title is I'm forgetting, but it's basically the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Treaty. And last I knew, there were 55 countries had signed on. It may be more than that now. It went into effect when 50 signed on. It was negotiated by all the non-nuclear powers of the country, of the world. The nuclear powers didn't participate. But that is now in effect and has many countries participating in it. That's what we should take initiatives and then go to the nuclear powers with the support of all these countries and say we want complete and mutual nuclear disarmament. So we can't have some crazy leader somewhere, whether it's a Donald Trump or a Vladimir Putin or whoever's running Pakistan or India, start a nuclear war that will be the end of us. And if Pakistan and India, they both have 80 to 100 nukes, as I recall, That's enough to create a nuclear winter, which means we won't have agriculture for up to 10 years, which means if the nukes don't get us, starvation will. This is a life or death existential threat, and it wasn't even talked about in the 2020 presidential race. It's not talked about now. And it should be top of the list. You know, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has their doomsday machine, our doomsday clock, the closest they've ever had it to midnight because of the new nuclear arms race. Because we're modernizing our nuclear weapons, so are the Russians and the Chinese. And we are now developing hypersonic strategic nukes that are 6 times faster than the old nukes, which means you don't have time to launch on warning. You have to launch on anticipation. The other side is going to launch if you want your nukes to get out before their nukes blow yours up. And then they have this tactical nuclear weapons doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. I mean, we are in the most dangerous nuclear situation we've ever been in. Plus, the Bulletin of Atomic Science noted 2 other things. Climate change, which escalates tensions and creates more opportunities for war to get out of hand and go nuclear. And then they made another point, which I think is something we got to grapple with. And they said disinformation propagated by states and non-state actors has got publics so confused that they can't come to agreement on the actions we need to take on climate and nuclear war, which creates, you know, a difficult situation to get our governments to move. So, yeah, the nuclear issue, I'm glad you raised it, and it's been raised today because it's something that needs to be talked about a lot more, and there needs to be a real peace movement, an anti-nuclear war movement, weapons movement, and we don't have one yet. Scout Trooper 164, humankind will never stop being violent. This world only had 5 minutes of peace. I think war is an institution that grows out of the structure of our societies. And so there have been societies that dealt with conflict in ritualized ways, somewhat violent. You know, tribes in Papua New Guinea had ritualized warfare, but it was very limited in the violence that actually inflicted on people, although it did inflict some. There have been, you know, the anthropological record shows, particularly among hunter-gathering societies, not a lot of warfare, you know, some conflict, but ways of dealing with that. You had here where I live in upstate New York, the Iroquois Confederacy, which about the year 1200, you know, they had endemic warfare among their tribes, and they adopted the Great Law of Peace and formed a confederacy that created a way for them to work out their differences and work together. So I do not accept that war is inevitable, and particularly in a capitalist world where states and corporations are competing for market share and cheap labor, resources, geopolitical positioning for the militaries that protect their property. You're going to have war and conflict. But in a socialist society, particularly an eco-socialist society, the point is to cooperate in producing what we need to meet our basic needs within ecological limits. That's a very different institutional structure and structure of incentives and motivations. So war is much less likely in that situation. Now, violence, individual violence, yes. You know, sometimes people deal with conflict with violence. I don't think you'll ever completely stamp that out. But war as an institution, yeah, I think we can work toward eliminating that. Mr. Anderson, Howie, what is your opinion on cooperative banks? Or what type of banking structure should I look into? Well, we do have cooperative banks. They're called credit unions. They are owned by the consumers, the people who deposit in those credit unions. They elect the boards. They are financial cooperatives. We do have a national cooperative bank that specializes in lending to cooperatives, particularly consumer cooperatives, but also worker cooperatives. And so I think they're great. I also think we need public banks that answer to the government that set them up, whether it's a municipality, a county, a state, or the federal government. And because they're publicly owned, they can finance projects that are high priority for the public that votes in the government, like creating clean energy generation facilities, wind, solar, and so forth, financing affordable housing or public housing as a form of affordable housing. So I would look into public banks. You Google that, you'll get a lot of good stuff on that. And cooperative banks or credit unions, and those are available just about everywhere. You can find a credit union. Some are community development credit unions that are based in geographical areas that anybody living there can join. Others are, the field of membership is a place of employment most commonly. So, where you work may have a credit union, a cooperative bank. Amy L. Sachs, it's troubling to me to know from the annual national meeting speakers, that's the annual national meeting of the Green Party, and this channel, that in some states, literally anyone can grab a local Green Party ballot line for themselves. And if the local party objects, too bad. Yes, that's the way. It's not just the Green Party that suffers from this. The Republicans had a problem with David Duke, the Klansman. The Democrats had a problem with David Metzger back in the 70s, also a Ku Klux Klansman, who got the ballot line by either petitioning and no one else ran for it, or by winning a primary. The Democrats had a problem with the conspiracist, fascist, really, Lyndon LaRouche. He got the U.S. Senate line. I think he took it away from Adlai Stevenson III. So the Democrats had to go out of their way to not support him. That's the problem with the way our state election laws have been set up, so that you either petition or win a primary and you get the ballot line, no matter what your politics, no matter how opposed they are to your party's politics. And so, what we can do to defend our ballot line is, first of all, run our own people and make sure they get the petition done and win the primary. And we can be overwhelmed by somebody who's well-funded, but that's one thing we can do. Now, if a candidate that the Green Party really doesn't support does get the ballot line, we have to make a public statement about that. We have had to do that in New York many times, because particularly Republicans, and we caught some of them, and they got convicted of crimes for misrepresenting who they were in their petitioning. But we had to publicly say, this person may have the green ballot line, but they are not Greens. They are not Green candidates. Don't vote for them. And those stories got coverage because, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's conflict in, newspapers and TVs like that. So, yeah, it's a problem. It's, most other countries, parties control their nominations. They have conventions. The members get together. They decide who's going to be on the ballot. In this country, and this grew out of the progressive era, and it was a probably honest attempt to get the decisions out of the boss's hands, like Tammany Hall, where they would pick and the average person had no say. So they wanted to give it to the average person, but they made it so open that we don't have parties with members. The parties are basically, you enroll in a party in, I think it's 27 states. The other 23 states, they don't even keep party enrollment. You just show up at primary day, and I say I want the Green ballot or the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot or some other ballot to vote in a primary. And in other states, they got jungle primaries where everybody's on the same primary, like California. And then the top two go to the general. So there are a lot of different systems. But the point is, party members don't have the say. It's whoever says they're in that party, and they get to vote in that primary. So you really don't have a party democracy making the nominations. Now, parallel to that, the Greens do have a party structure. We can state our preferred candidates and then shepherd them through the petitioning and primary process. But you're right, we aren't organized for every race, and we see candidates who are crackpots or even from other parties grabbing our ballot line. I mean, the Republicans do it in New York because they think it'll split the Democratic vote and help their Republican candidate. So they get a Republican to switch their enrollment to green, get on the ballot line, and really not campaign, but be there. So people go in the polls and want to vote for the Green Party, and they vote for that candidate, even though they're really a Republican. So there are a lot of electoral reforms we need: fair ballot access, proportional representation, public financing that's accessible to minor parties like the Greens as well as the major parties. We need nonpartisan election administration. I mean, what other country has the two governing parties administering their own elections? And now the Republicans want to make it so in states they control, they can decide who won, even though they didn't win. We got a lot of things to change, but another one is party autonomy. Parties should be able to nominate however they see fit. They can have the state run a primary. A lot of parties are going to continue to do that, but I would like to see the Green Party nominate by convention, which in states where we don't have major party status, we already mostly can do. There's some states where we do and have to have a primary, like California. New York, until we lost our ballot line, had the option of doing it in a state-run primary or an internal primary. And so it varies from state to state. But yeah, you identify a problem. It is troubling. And but we got ways of dealing with it. And I think the longer-term solution is to change the election law so parties can have real members who decide who their candidates are, the way most countries do it. Eric Gray, how do we stop the pipeline of patriotism to fascism in the United States? Yeah, well, first of all, we can't let the fascists take over the streets. And they're in the process of doing that. They're intimidating school board members over masking mandates. They're intimidating election administrators who will not go along with their attempts to overturn elections, or well, that's what they're upset with. Now they're doing these crazy recounts. Arizona just had a farcical one now. Pennsylvania starting one, Wisconsin starting one. But I think the first thing is, when the fascists show up on the streets, we got to be there too. There are more of us than there are of them. We got to organize well, just totally outnumber them and discourage them. That has worked historically. And we need to do that before they take over the streets and start, using violence to cow their opposition into submission. I don't see the fascists as that patriotic, in the classic sense of, supporting the military. They're trashing the Capitol Police and the DC Metropolitan Police for what they did defending the, Capitol on January 6th. You've seen these pictures of like the militia there in Michigan when they took over the State House, screaming in the face of cops with masks on, but the protesters not having their masks on, totally disrespecting law and order. What's that saying? Patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. I mean, people will wrap themselves in, patriotic rhetoric, but they really aren't, supporting the people of this country. So maybe it's the pipeline of militarism to fascism that we need to be worried about. But again, while U.S. elites are very militaristic and have this enormous military budget to protect their properties around the world, a lot of Americans aren't with that. Although I will say, among all the issues of public opinion polling, progressives are least successful in calling for cuts to the military budget, because the propaganda about supposed threats to our national security and safety here in the United States are totally overblown. I mean, what country is going to send a force to invade us across one of the big oceans? Mexico's not coming. Canada's not coming. I mean, we are very well protected geographically. The real threat we face are nuclear weapons. And, that's we're partly responsible for that because we initiated this new nuclear arms race in the Obama administration to modernize our nuclear forces to the tune of trillions of dollars. So I think, to stop the fascism, don't let them take over the streets. We've got to fight for voting rights and election reform so that the fascistic Republican minority does not get power from a minority vote. That's a huge issue. We need a very strong pro-democracy movement. And the Democrats obviously are not leading it. They will see what they do with the Freedom to Vote Act, which has good things, but also the bad thing I mentioned about public campaign financing and eliminating the primary matching funds program that only the Green Party now uses. So there's that. But the Democrats, they have passed laws in New York, in Nevada, and other states to make it harder for the Green Party to get on a ballot. And party suppression is a form of voter suppression. We know from the 2016 exit polls that 61% of the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein's voters, would not have voted if she was not on the ballot. That means the Greens bring new voters to the polls. And when the Greens are not on the ballot, those people don't vote. So party suppression is a form of voter suppression. It's what authoritarian governments do. It's what Putin is doing in this elections coming up in Russia, where anybody that was really opposed to him got knocked off the ballot. I have to say it's what the Maduro government just did to a left-winger supported by the communists and this other left-wing party running for mayor. I think it was Caracas. He just got knocked off the ballot with no explanation last week. Noriega in Nicaragua has knocked off all these old Sandinistas before they even declared. That's what authoritarian governments do. That's what we say in the United States we don't do, but we do. And it's the Democratic Party doing it. So voting, ballot access is a huge issue that we've got to fight for so that we can fight the fascists as the Green Party, because the Democratic Party is not doing a very good job. This voting rights stuff should have passed last spring. And we'll see what they do this week, but it's not looking good. So I guess that's my little rant on how to fight the fascists. But we cannot rely on the soft right Republicans to fight the hard right. The soft right Democrats to fight the hard right Republicans. Because the Democrats, they can't do it because they really don't fight. Eduardo Heredia Quintana Fernandez. Do we really have time for all these electoral reforms while the planet is burning and global climate change is an existential threat? I don't know if we got time, but we got to fight because otherwise the Greens are marginalized in the current structure of U.S. politics. The Republicans, as an extremist, authoritarian, racist party, have got all the center and progressive left people voting for Democrats to stop the crazy Republicans, which totally marginalizes the Greens, who are the ones who got solutions to this climate issue. You watch what comes out of this reconciliation bill. It's going to be token climate programs. There's no way that Biden can meet his goal that he just pulled out his ass when he had those other countries here back at the end of April and said, we're going to, what did he say? 50% cut in carbon emissions by 2030? Yeah, there's no way in what he proposed in his full American Jobs Plan they could do that. I wrote a 10,000-word article on that. That's also up on Counterpunch. No, that one, the shorter version is on Counterpunch. It's on the Solidarity webzine. It's on the HowieHawkins.us website. So we gotta do both. We gotta fight for electoral reform, so we're fighting for our right to be in U.S. politics in a way that's relevant. And we got to keep fighting on the climate change. We got to be in the streets. We got to keep raising our voices and just fight like hell, because you're right. They're turning the planet into a burning hell with this burning of fossil fuels, and it's getting worse and at an accelerating rate. So, but if we don't fight for the electoral reforms, we're basically saying we're marginal to electoral politics. We're accepting the marginalization by the institutions of American politics, the marginalization of the Green Party, and that's basically eliminating the Green Party ability to have influence on what the government does with respect to climate change. At war with dust. Yeah, me too. We got this leaded paint around here. Most kids are, about 40% of the kids in my neighborhood have lead poison. Have heard that the Green Party needs to run presidential candidates to keep ballot access for lower office holders. Can you elaborate on that? Yeah, in many states, most states, in order to be able to run on a Green Party ballot line at any level, you got to have a state Green Party ballot line. So, for example, here in New York, with the ballot line, our candidates for lower office had to get petitions of 5% of the enrolled Greens in their district. So, like in my city, we have about 1,000 enrolled Greens, city of Syracuse. So we need a petition of 50 to run for, say, mayor, citywide. Without a ballot line, we need a petition of 1,500 collected in 42 days. It's a lot more difficult. So, and then in New York, you can put the Green Party label. In some states, when you do an independent petition, you can't put the Green Party label. There are 51 different jurisdictions, counting the District of Columbia, and every one of them has different rules. But the general, most common situation is if you don't have a state ballot line, you cannot, or it's very difficult to get candidates for lower office on the ballot as a Green candidate. One of the ways you get a state ballot line in many states is to get a certain number or percentage of the vote for your presidential candidate. So, for example, using New York, it was 50,000 votes. Well, actually, no, it's 50,000 votes for governor. You couldn't do it for president until they just changed the law and made it a lot harder. Now it's 135,000 votes, or 2%. Well, 2% was 173,000 votes in 2020. And only 2 Green candidates running statewide have ever got that many. Ralph Nader in 2000, running for president, and me for governor in 2014. So it's very difficult, standard now, in New York. And it ranges from state to state. It's 0.5% for president in New Mexico. It's 20% in Alabama. So it's state by state. But when we researched this, when we ran for president, we found it was 39 or 40 states where the presidential vote had an impact on whether that state's Green Party would have a ballot line going forward. So that's the elaboration, and it gets complicated because we got 51 different state election laws. But that's the situation we're in. Vicky Corden, what do you think of the Green Party in Germany? If the Green Party wins, what can the USA learn from them? Well, I think the Green Party in Germany is a mixed bag from our point of view. They're pretty good on energy and environment. They have not been so good on economic justice. They accommodated the neoliberal turn led by the old socialists, the Social Democratic Party, in the 90s, and got involved in I guess it was the Afghanistan War and the Balkan Wars, Germany sending troops off their home territory for the first time since World War II. And that is, a kind of militarism that was antithetical to what the Green Party in Germany formed on, which was against, in the early years, the missile crisis, the intermediate range nuclear missiles that both West Germany and East Germany had pointed right at each other And in the contentions of the Cold War, people were afraid it would create a nuclear war. So they were very much an anti-militarist party. Now they are more a NATO party. Unlike some of the other Green parties, which are anti-NATO, particularly the Nordic left-green alliance parties, who are in power or share power in, I think, all the Nordic states now, including the Prime Minister of Iceland. So it's a mixed bag. The woman running for chancellor at one point was leading. She's now in third place, but not that far behind. So what can we learn from them? Well, first two things come to mind is we need a system of proportional representation, because the German Greens actually get a smaller percentage of the vote than we get in our winner-take-all single-member district plurality elections. We got more support for Green politics in this country than they do in Germany. Yet they've been in the parliament since 1983, because if you get 5% or more of the vote, you're in the Bundestag, their national parliament, and similar proportions at their municipal and state legislative bodies. So proportional representation is something we really got to fight for. I think the other thing is the German Greens moved to the right as they got closer to power. And because they have a parliamentary system where the executive branch is chosen by the legislative branch, the executive government, the leading party forms a coalition. And to get in those coalitions, the Greens had to compromise. So they compromised on their economic program and their anti-militarist program. The other thing I'll say is the Greens are to be commended in Germany and across Europe. They're the only political trend in Europe that has not succumbed to the anti-immigrant bigotry that all the other parties at least have factions that have, including the former communist parties now call themselves the left in Germany, and democratic socialists in other countries, the socialist parties, as well as the center and right parties. The Greens have resisted that, to their credit. And so they're very good on the feminism, the anti-racism, the equal rights for LGBTQ people. So they're good on the social issues. And on the economic issues, they've moved back to at least the center left. They have a Green New Deal, which is not eco-socialist, it's more neo-Keynesian, but it does try to have the government uplift living standards as it builds a clean energy economy. So we'll see how the Greens do. And I think we agree with them on a lot, but have some differences. Oh, wow, that was a fast hour. So I guess no more questions. I appreciate everybody showing up. I just started to look at the comments, haven't had a chance. I see a lot of old names and some new names and some old names I haven't seen in a while. It's good to see everybody. Keep your eye on what happens in Congress this week with voting rights. I think that's going to tell us a lot about where we stand. And I've been saying this, I think the Green Party and the broader independent left really has to take leadership on this pro-democracy agenda. The Democrats don't have their heart in it. You know, when you put them all together, you know, Biden hasn't made it a big issue. Manchin doesn't seem to care. You don't have as much commentary and energy around this issue as you do around the reconciliation bills. And that's a shame. The abortion issue got a lot of energy the last couple of weeks, but I don't know how sustained that will be. And we got to be out there. The one thing you keep seeing on the far right is energy. During the campaign, you know, Trump people, they were having motorcycle rallies right through the hood here in Syracuse. I guess just to bug people. They were having their boat parades. They were doing all kinds of things on their own. They had a lot of energy. Whereas the left was kind of, during the COVID pandemic, not going out. Trump people were knocking on doors. Biden people discouraged that. even though it could be done safely with social distancing and masking. So I guess I'm just pitching people, get up, get off the couch, get out, talk to people, build your local groups, and fight, because the far right is making gains, even though they're a minority, and the soft right Democrats don't know how to fight them. So it's really up to us. So I'll see you next week. We're going to have some local candidates, green candidates on in future programs. There'll be announcements about that. And that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in.